Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Level Up podcast. I'm your host, Ken Rose, co-founder and CTO at OpsLevel. OpsLevel is an internal developer portal that helps engineering teams quickly ship quality software. Our Level Up podcast explores challenges, best practices, and stories from some of the brightest engineering and product leaders about what it takes to build great products, teams, and companies. And today, I'm excited to welcome Zayna Shahzad, VP of Engineering at OneSignal. OneSignal is a notifications platform that lets businesses increase customer engagement and retention through messaging at various points in the customer journey. They boast over 1 million customers and have 150 plus people with around 60 in product development. Prior to OneSignal, Zayna served in engineering leadership roles at both Plaid and InVision. So Zayna, really, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ken. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
So, I've introduced you a little bit, but why don't you just tell all the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I can start a little bit at the beginning. So I went to school in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area at San Jose State. My first job out of college was as a software engineer, and I worked for a company called Yelp. This was prior to them selling the E24 business to Grubhub. And so that was really exciting. That was my first job. I didn't stay there for too long. Turns out that a 2-hour commute one way sort of is draining and made me realize that I wanted a little bit more out of life. So I actually ended up going to work at a company called IBM, small little place. And that was heard of them. They were local to San Jose, and I ended up working on, I was doing something called Management Console. It allowed you to see essentially like the control panel for your DB2 ZOS systems and being able to see things like health checks and do configurations and things like that. So I was working on that dashboard. So started off as a software engineer very early on in my career, and then I ended up at PagerDuty, and that's where we met. So I think I started at PagerDuty, I think that was in 2015 or so. And I stayed there for, I think, 3.5 years or something like that. And largely I was there as a mobile engineer. I was working on their Android app at the time. I was sort of bootstrapping, and starting to break away from an existing team that they currently had. And then I remember a year into it, one of the decisions had been made that we were no longer going to have a dedicated mobile team. We were going to disperse all the members. And so I ended up going on to the notifications team actually at PagerDuty. And I worked as a software engineer on the team that was responsible for real-time notifications. So I don't know, it feels maybe a little bit serendipitous in terms of what I do right now, but that's where I ended up. And I remember leaving because I was like, oh, well, I really wanted to do mobile. I don't get to do mobile. So I ended up working at Google as an engineer, and spent a little bit of time there. And then I remember I was catching up with like a previous manager, ended up back at PagerDuty. And next thing I knew, I was grabbing lunch. And next thing I knew, I ended up in a conference room with like my previous manager and with Tim, who's now the CTO there. And he was like, we want you to come back and we want you to be the manager for this mobile team. And here's the head count. And, and at that point, I basically walked out of that conference room having signed my return offer and like coming back to the company. And that was actually the start of my management career. So something I sort of fell into and just continued on in the process. And from there, as you mentioned, ended up at InVision, got to learn a lot of the lessons of what not to do, which were really exciting. And I think some battle-tested strategies that I had learned from my time there. And then ended up at Plaid, which was different for me, which was in fintech still within engineering management. Got to have a team of around 15 engineers. And was responsible for their data access for Canada and US, which was incredible. And then ended up at OneSignal, which is where I am now. And when I started at the company, I was responsible for product engineering. So I think we had about 5 teams. This was about 2 years ago. We had about 5 teams, 15 engineers. And 7 months into my time at OneSignal, my manager was actually leaving. He was the VP of engineering, and he was like, I think you would be the right fit for the role, so I want you to take it. And we ended up having that conversation, did the transitions. I think we had like 10 teams, 30 engineers by that point that I was responsible for. And now a year later, I just got promoted to VP of engineering, and now we have about 60 engineers within the company. So that's where it's sort of led me to where I am now.
That's amazing. Well, and congratulations again on that recent promotion, and no doubt well deserved.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'd love to go back to that conference room meeting with Pagery, right? You have Tim, I know Tim also, so I say as well, he's grilling you like, yeah, Zayna, you should come back. But outside of the maybe, social pressure that was in that room, can you talk about some of the factors that you considered when making that departure from being an IC to being a manager?
In some ways, I sort of always knew at the beginning of my career that I knew I didn't see myself just hands-on coding 100% of the time, 10, 20 years from now. I don't know what it was. I sort of knew that. But at the same time, I knew I wanted to stay technical. I wanted to stay as close as possible to what it was that we were doing in tech and in software engineering. And so I actually didn't know what that role could really look like for me. I just figured I'll find out what that looks like a little bit later on. And some of the things that I sort of went through and realized was, one, I really like understanding how people are motivated to do their best work. Like that was the piece for me that was incredibly challenging. It's sort of like, not to like trivialize it, but I do sort of think of it as like debugging a system. And that was very reminiscent to me in terms of just the systems that I had worked on previously. I was like, well, how do you make this thing work? And this thing was the organization and how people interact with each other and how you try and get them to do their best work. And I sort of became very like fascinated with some of those problems. And I started to see a lot of the parallels that I saw in software engineering. And I could probably talk on and on about what those parallels were, but I saw a lot of the similarities between being an engineer, designing systems and designing applications to what I think it really meant to design organizations. And I didn't realize all of this exactly at the time, but I do think that in hindsight, that was the feeling that I was getting that led to me saying yes to that opportunity. It was really to figure out, how are people motivated? How do you make this thing successful? How do you make teams successful? And I think the last bit of it for me was I've always been the type of person that says yes, even if I don't know what I'm doing, even if I don't know what it's going to involve. I knew, there's no school that you can go to learn about engineering management. You sort of have to learn by doing and from learning from others. And I came to that realization where it was just like, this is who I am. This is sort of true to who I am. I want to say yes. I want to see through to this new opportunity. And if it ends up not working out, it ends up not working out. I can always go back to doing exactly what I was. So just having that maybe safety net is the right way to put it, or just knowing that I had options was something that made that transition so much easier for me, going from an IC to a manager all of a sudden, basically overnight.
That's awesome. One of the things I wanted to ask, you talked about, when you first start out as a manager, right, that there are some kind of stumbling blocks. You, I think, mentioned in Vision. What are some ways maybe that you stumble, that you've seen new managers stumble as they're kind of like feeling their way through this, lack of curriculum and trying to understand what the role is?
Yeah, I think my biggest stumbling block, and it happened very, very early on for me as a manager, was dealing with performance management. And, the frustrating thing for me was I wasn't equipped with, I think, the skills to be able to have difficult conversations with people very, very early on in my career. And I had to learn through that. I stumbled through it. I would say pretty hard. It was not smooth sailing for me at all. I actually had to, unfortunately, let go of someone as like one of my first couple things that I did as a manager within my first couple months. And I remember being so beaten up about it, could not sleep, could not eat. Like, it was shaking me to my core that like this was something that I had to do. This was a conversation that I had to have. And it came down to, I think, just setting expectations of what is reasonable or what is sort of expected out of the responsibilities for a particular role. And I think a lot of that is what I have started to really start to incorporate into everything that I do at this point. Like, make sure expectations are set from the get-go. Don't get into a place where someone says they do not know, or they are unaware of what success looks like for them, or they do things that are not in line with what you would have wanted. Make sure those expectations are there from day one. And I would say, like, that advice that I gave to myself after that entire experience, I have like stayed true to, even through all of these like different transitions of companies. And even in terms of like promotions now, I make sure, what is that next level of expectations that I want to make sure is set with everyone who now reports to me or is on my team. And that was, I think, the biggest struggle for me, is like, how do I figure out how to have those really difficult conversations very early on? And, I came through on the other side, and it's great. And I had some lessons, but I think apart from learning that, like, day one, those expectations need to be set, the other piece that I really, really learned through that process was, one, you can't really save everyone. You can say what your expectations are sort of on them to do the other piece. And there's only so much that you'll be able to do as a manager. And the last was, people really have to be invested in their own personal growth. You can't force them to sit down at their desk, produce code in a certain way, or talk to or interact with people in a certain way. Like, some of these things are very much on the individual and them wanting to grow in areas as well. So learned all of those lessons going through those experiences. And, now I will say, at least I know how to handle them. I don't know if there's, if it's like perfect. I think there's always opportunities for improvement, but at least I feel like I've gotten the performance management aspect of it down through several, I think, other scenarios that have happened since then as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of times, because in our society, we're taught, like, from a young age, share, be nice. Like, and so there's very much this idea, like, oh, you want to be nice to people. And it's hard to have those tough conversations, right? I can say for me as a manager, what made it simpler was, like, I realized if I'm too nice to, like, a person, I may be not being nice to the company, right? In the sense that, like, or the rest of the team, in that, like, this person's lack of performance is actually impacting a whole bunch of other people around them, and you're doing those people a disservice by not having those hard conversations and setting those expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that with that, something else that goes with it, and I think was a hard-earned learning, was it's almost harder, or it's probably worse for you to not make a decision in terms of what next steps should look like than, just making the wrong decision. It's almost better for you to make a quick decision, because that's going to result in the best outcome for probably everyone, than just stringing things along or conversations along, hoping they turn around, and just sort of like taking your sweet time with it. And so I had to come to that realization again, where, the first time I had to have those tough conversations, I would have said I probably took way too long to have them. It was like, okay, do it really nicely in the first conversation, maybe a little bit more nicely in the other, and then talk to everybody else about it instead of that person. It was another phase that I went through. And I think just all of it, when you take a look back at it, is just such a time sink, and is emotionally draining for you personally, and probably for that other person. And so I think, moving quickly and optimizing for just making a quick decision is something that I think I absolutely learned from that context and from those scenarios. And at this point, I feel like now I've built up the gut a little bit more of being a little bit more confident in my abilities to make decisions, even if I don't have all the data, even if it feels uncomfortable. Making a decision in often cases, especially in my role now, is a little bit better than just not making one at all.
Absolutely. As you were describing that, it sounded like you have an example that you were thinking about. Like, are there any examples of times in your career when you maybe didn't make a decision and felt you should have, even if it might have been a wrong one?
I think it does have to do with some of those like performance management cases, where it's been a little bit more difficult to just make that quick call. But I would say like the most recent example is a little bit of I think I had alluded to in our pre-recording chat was the like engineering reorg that we went through recently at OneSignal. So there's a little bit of history there, but what it looked like was we had a bunch of challenges. I can definitely enumerate all of those challenges and kind of walk through those as well. But it was sort of like everyone was looking to me to make a decision, that it was my decision to make on whether or not we were going to reorganize our teams and the individuals and the reporting structures and what teams' missions were. And there was really going to be nobody else to be able to make that decision for the entire engineering org. And so having all of these individuals kind of look to you to make a decision and you not making one is, I think, one of the worst things that you could probably do as a leader, where I think that can break people's trust very quickly. They may not necessarily see you as very action-oriented or solution-oriented. And so I took that as an opportunity to say, yeah, I can make really hard decisions. One, to prove it to myself, but also because I think the organization just like really needed it, just based off of the things that I was seeing. And you go and, feel a little bit more validated by having conversations with peers around you, making sure that you're not making decisions that are going to be unreasonable or are going to put the organization in jeopardy in some way. And I think once you get that level of validation, at least a little bit, that everyone is sort of looking for some sort of a solution here. Maybe they don't know what the solution might actually be. I say you pull the trigger and try something out. If it doesn't work, you try something again, and you just continue doing that over and over again. And I think that's largely what led to some of the rework that we ended up doing a little bit earlier.
Awesome. I'd love actually to pull on that thread a little bit, but maybe we can first go back in time. You've overseen the kind of this period of growth at OneSignal from 20 engineers to now about 60. So What do you find is different now managing 60 than managing 20? Maybe even before you pull this reorg, can you talk a little bit about what that change was from 20 to 60 and how you scaled OneSignal and scaled yourself?
Yeah. The obvious answer is that there's just simply a lot more people to keep on top of at this point. And when I say that, it's purely in terms of being able to represent and speak for engineering in ways that to the rest of the organization, you're representing a cohesive picture of what it is that they're working on, what their priorities are, what they're struggling with potentially. So in order to be able to do that, you sort of have to have all these different mechanisms to be able to grab information. And when you're an organization or dealing with like 20, 30 individuals, that's a lot easier to do. You still have the ability to, even though it would be difficult, but you still have the ability to, over 2 weeks, go meet every single person, have conversations with them, and sort of know exactly what they're working on and why they're working on those things, and maybe even nudge some of those things along. When it gets to 60, I found myself actually struggling with that a little bit more, where I was like, how am I going to speak to 60 individuals on top of all of the other relationships across the business that I have to have and where I spend my time? So, that's something where I had to be a little bit more intentional in terms of how I was gathering information, how I was sharing information with the rest of the organization, and sort of the opportunities for me to be able to optimize my own time. And so I started taking a look at my calendar. I started categorizing things. Okay, these are my skip levels and my one-on-ones with directs. And I went through that entire process. I almost feel like it was necessary for me to be able to figure out, how can I understand all the things that are going on in my organization without actually having to ask anyone, or maybe doing it in lightweight touch points instead. So I would say that was probably the biggest one. And then I think the other piece of it was I came to the realization that, when you're dealing with 15 people, you can probably be in most of the conversations that they're going to be in. And when you're dealing with 60 people, and I'm sure it probably looks very different for like 500 people as well, but when you get to that level, I can't be a part of every single conversation. And so that means that there are a lot of things that are happening across the business, conversations that are happening, decisions that are being made that I will not be in the room for. And one of the things that I really wanted to challenge myself with was, how do I make it so that I set the right context for everyone in my team, ensure that they have an understanding of what it is that we're trying to prioritize or optimize for, and that they could use to turn around and make decisions day to day that make sense, that would have been similar to the decisions I would have made had I been there. And so contextualizing things, giving them the information, but not necessarily being there in their day to day, I think was one of the ways that I sort of helped to scale myself. Was, if I can't be there, I have to make sure that people are, making decisions that I would probably agree with in some way, shape, or form. And to be able to do that, you just have to, I think, be an information giving machine, or like context giving machine to people constantly. So getting up in engineering all hands, talking about what our priorities are, what our values are, what are we trying to prioritize, why we're trying to prioritize it. Those sorts of avenues became so much more important to me than maybe a one-on-one conversation where I could only get through to maybe a single individual or a single manager.
Yeah, I love that part, because it's really about the leverage that you're getting in that communication. Like, when I think of my own experiences of like times that teams went off the rails, it's because there wasn't that shared understanding of like, this is our mandate, or these are the goals that we're having, or not everybody was aligned to what those things are. And sometimes then you do need one-on-one conversations to debug some of that, but it's important to get that kind of high leverage communication and that intentionality for where you're where you're making those comms. Yeah. I want to ask, are there any kind of like, how do you think about those decision-making guidelines? Like, do you have any like specific or actionable tips or techniques for like, how do you communicate to your team, here's how to make good decisions?
I think for me, it started off with my own personal values. So the things that I really value, I actually took inventory of those things. I noted those out. What are the things that are very true about me? And that was, I love being action oriented. So I'm not, at this point now I am kind of talking a little bit about our earlier conversation. So being very action oriented is something that I want to make sure that people optimize for. Optimizing for customers. There's somebody at the end of the screen, someone that they're building for. Optimizing for customers was something that I very much wanted to be true about the organization, and I wanted to be true about myself. Because I think that is what is going to lead to greater outcomes for the business and for the organization. And there was an aspect of like true ownership, accountability, and transparency that was really important to me as well. I think people know that about me personally. I tend to be very transparent. However, whatever's happening behind closed doors, I will share with people sort of freely as much as I possibly can. And there's a sense of ownership and accountability that goes along with it, which is, no one's sitting there watching the clock, trying to make sure that you're doing your work. As long as you're driving outcomes for the business, you're being customer obsessed, you are sort of being true to what the organization would expect of you. Like, those are all the right things. That's within the right realm of things that would be expected of you. And so I think it started off for me as like figuring out what are the things that I really value personally. And then it was, well, how do I make sure that that's the type of organization that I build? And I started to think about, well, what are those values? How do we optimize for certain things? You're always optimizing for something. And so one of the common questions that people will hear me say in meetings and when one-on-ones is, what are you optimizing for? When they give me like a jumble of bunch of different options and things like that, and they just are rambling on and on about all of these different like pros and cons or whatever. And I just simply ask them like, what is it that you're optimizing for? And that sort of like reels them back in and say, well, I want to optimize for speed because there's a customer at the end of all of this that like really needs this feature or whatever it is. And so that helps like shake out what the solutions end up being. You do that enough times, they kind of do it on their own. And I find that that's actually really valuable to do with especially managers, because they then can go on and do those those types of exercises with their own teams as well. So I think really for me, it starts off with personally knowing yourself and knowing your values, and then sort of applying that to your organization and seeing how closely you can align your own almost personality, your own spin of how to run engineering orgs to the org that you're responsible for.
Yeah, I love that question also, like, what are you optimizing for? Because a phenomenon I've seen is that folks will come to you as a manager with a bunch of context. It's like, hey, I have this and this option, this, blah, 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 blah. What do you think I should do? And it's like, real man, like, now I have to download all that context that you just gave me, and you have so much more context on, and try to make the decision for you, and that's not my role. And so that question is a great way to invert that and say, no, what are you optimizing for? Like, what should we do? Help me guide you, but you're going to be the one that's making this decision and can be accountable for it.
Right, exactly. I think similar to that kind of goes, you have to give them the opportunities to be able to make their own decisions. Like, you can't, I think as a leader, you can't sort of put a fake limit to the amount of ownership or decision making that they would have. Like, if you truly are putting them in a place where they should be able to own those decisions. How is something architected, or what sort of decision do we make about the rollout of a feature, or how quickly we do it? Based off of whatever it is, the context that they have shared with you, ultimately you can help guide that a little bit. But at the end of the day, I do really try and strive for making sure they know they're in the hot seat. It gives them a whole lot of ownership and accountability for, if you make the wrong decision, it'll be back on you. It's going to be, you'll learn something from it at least. You'll iterate on it. Next time around, it'll be better. But I want you to really own that decision. And again, I think that's one of the other things that has sort of helped me scale, is making sure that other people feel comfortable making decisions. It's not just top down, or everything is top down.
I want to ask, as you went through that scaling motion of 20 to 60, were there any habits you had to sort of unlearn? You kind of touched on, like, not being able to do one-on-ones with everybody to get information, but any habits that, you kind of had to unlearn to be able to work at a larger scale?
I would be, very in-depth, in the weeds with a lot of, like, bugs that would come along. Every single bug that would come along to the Eng org had to go through me initially. And it was my way of being like, oh, well, this is a duplicate. We can close that one. This one is actually a feature request. We put it here instead. This particular team should take on this particular ask. And I think a lot of it was this, like, I don't know, it was almost like a need to protect the team from bugs. Are usually, they're not anticipated in most cases. Certainly it doesn't feel good to have like broken functionality. And so I would try and, like, protect them from this, like, barrage of bugs that would come to the individual engineering teams. And I had to step away from that. I had to so quickly step away from that, because I could no longer spend, the beginning of my day and the end of my day an hour to just, like, triage bugs for all these individual teams. And so I had to unlearn that. And some part of it was just automating the entire process, making it so, we use Asana. So unfortunately we use Asana, because I would have preferred Jira my entire career. I've used Jira, and I ended up here and we use Asana, and I've come to like it. But one of the great things about it that I have learned is that it allows you to do, like, triaging rules. You can set up all sorts of, like, Zapier style, if this then that sort of rules, which I found really useful. And that basically lets us do everything that I was doing manually in the entire process is now automated. And up to a certain extent, as long as it gets to the right team, it's on them. They can close it. They can figure out there's another feature that overlaps with it. They can say, known issue, can't address it, doesn't impact too many people. They can address it, treat it as a P0. Like, all of those things are sort of out of my hands at this point. And the right things happen. So I did have to unlearn that. And I think the bigger thing for me was just staying out of the weeds a little bit and allowing teams to just, like, do what it is that is necessary for them, have their own processes to figure out what that looks like. And I actually think that's opened up a lot of my time to be able to go focus on the things that I think for the organization really do matter, which is primarily around, creating context and working with cross-functional partners and making sure the rest of the organization has an understanding in terms of what we're doing. And that's far better use of my time at this point than sitting there in Asana trying to triage every single bug.
That makes a ton of sense. As you were describing, like that you're sitting there triaging all of them, like all of them, like there must be a lot, and there's a leverage argument, right, to be made. And it sounds like now you've found a way to, automate and delegate and just bump yourself up in terms of that leverage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was every single bug at that point. No longer. Now I can't even tell you what bug backlogs look like. So I think it's been a pretty drastic change for over the past, 2 years or so.
Nice. You mentioned, a reorg that OneSignal recently went through. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how the product development team was arranged before, some of the inputs that went into we do need a reorg, and then, how you actually implement it and what it looks like after.
Yeah. So a little bit of history in terms of what the organization looked like previously. I think the company at the time was probably around 20, or the engineering org at least was around 25-ish people or so. And they had 3 different functions, essentially. They were organized by technical area. So we had the mobile people, was one of the groups. The back-end infrastructure people were the other group, was the second group, and they were primarily Go Rust engineers. And then we had a third group, which was what we called our full stack people, but they were really front-end people. They worked primarily, or there was more individuals within that group that were front-end focused, so they worked in React. And some of them did Rails, a little bit here and there, but for the most part, a majority of what they worked on was the actual dashboard itself, and it was primarily React stuff. And even as we sort of rebranded these teams, the mobile team was no longer the mobile team. We called them the SDK team. They were still largely thought as the mobile people, the back-end people, and the front-end people. And those were the 3 groups that we had. And one of the things that we started to run up into was, as we got larger and larger, we now were also taking on far more complex projects. And that meant that in order to be able to do a particular feature, we had to go across the entire stack of what we had. We had to make changes to our SDKs in the mobile space. We had to do something on the back end, create a new service or something like that, or new API endpoints. And then we also had a dashboard experience that kind of accompanied all of it. And so now all of these people had to go and coordinate across all of these different areas. And what we found was we had extremely tightly coupled dependencies. And what it meant was it was just very painful for planning purposes. A team here has their priority in terms of what they want to accomplish in a quarter. When we go to do our quarterly planning and OKR process, they go to this other team, this other group, and say, hey, we're going to need a back-end person because we need to work on this feature. We need to get it out by X date. And they're like, yeah, great, wonderful. And then they go and talk to this other person on the SDK side who does the same thing. And none of their priorities really actually aligned. They were all working on different projects. They all had their own projects, and they were sort of lending out people in sort of this agency model. And the assumption was, they weren't going to stay with that team, with those group of individuals, with that particular project. As soon as the quarter was over, they were going to completely disband, go work on their next thing instead. And so the tightly coupled nature and really having to know what the priorities were and whose project actually takes precedence over even something they personally had in their own backlog. It just became very convoluted, very complex when we started to get to, I want to say about 40 people or so, 45 people. At that point, it was just projects were all over the place and everyone wanted help from everyone. We were sort of stuck there. But the other thing that I think it created was it created these like weird artificial limits in terms of what people could do within their particular group. So the React people always had to stay as React people. They were never really expected to learn about Rust or Go or mobile SDKs or anything like that. And so there's this like weird artificial barrier that we put in place, which was like, actually, that's cool. You want to learn about this thing, but the backend people are over here instead. And so like they do that stuff. And that just felt like really, it felt very uncomfortable to me because, again, it wasn't aligned with like my own personal values of just like taking ownership over a thing and like driving forward to completing it and learning things as you go. And so it was not, it just personally didn't jive with how I wanted the organization to look like, apart from, all the other issues that we were having in terms of the dependencies we had created. And I think, some of the nature of people moving here and there, it sort of also led to you didn't have people who were experts in any particular area, because anytime they worked on a project or a new feature, they worked on it for that quarter or for however long, and then they walked away from it and they went to go work on the next thing after that. And so what you find is you have all of these people who don't have a whole lot of depth in the particular area that they worked on, and everything was like very shallow. And maybe they were experts in their particular areas, like backend people were experts in scaling and performance and distributed systems and things like that. But when it actually came to the feature work that they were contributing to, it was extremely shallow because, they didn't have the opportunity to really spend time in that problem space, really think about those problems and some of the challenges, edge cases, everything that you run into as you start getting actual usage and starting to have to scale with, customers adopting whatever that feature is. So it became like really frustrating, I think, for a lot of engineers, and people would even come to me and say, planning sucks and I want to learn this other new thing, and they're not prioritizing the things that we are prioritizing. And I just would have a whole bunch of people come in, essentially talk to me about some of the challenges that they were having, and I sat down and I started like itemizing all of these things. I like started taking notes on all of them. I was like, there has to be a solution here. How have I seen this work in other organizations? And one of the realizations that I came to was every organization that I had worked at had fully vertical teams. They had teams who were fully autonomous. All of the skills that they needed that were necessary lived within their team so that they could independently drive their own roadmaps. And maybe they consult other teams for some project maybe they're unfamiliar with, but largely they were able to drive their own roadmaps. And that realization was what had sort of unlocked what I thought was going to be the next step of maturity for the engineering organization, and what ultimately led to the reorg that we ended up having a little bit earlier this year.
That's really interesting. As you're describing this, I'm thinking like, I work on a product that is about helping people categorize their ownership, and I'm like, yeah, there's not a lot of ownership going on here as you're describing it. And in fact, it was interesting. The organization is sort of inducing the model it wants. Like people are plucking people like I need a backend developer. Like they're trying to get to that model. It's like, hey, then you got to go back at the end of the quarter. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Actually, that is a good point. What ended up happening is we had on our backend team, we had a services team, and they were responsible for every single service that we had at the organization. And I remember like basically tearing my hair out thinking like, how are we going to scale this team? What is that going to look like? If we ever get to 100 engineers, are they just going to own every single service? Do I just need to keep on like piling people here so they can keep loaning people out? Like, what does that model really look like? So as I began to really ask myself those questions of like ownership and what that would look like, I really tried to place myself in a perspective of, okay, 2 years from now, what could the engineering org look like? How big could it be? What are the projects that we could be working on? And that, I think, a lot of asking those questions from myself and from others around me, that started to unlock what I think was sort of necessary for us to go through. And the answers of ownership sort of became solved at that point, because it was like, yeah, you own whatever your team is responsible for. You have a mission, you have some business outcome you're probably trying to drive with the team that you work on. Your priorities are there. You have all the skills that you need within that team. Go forward and, have some KPI and make that line move up into the right or down into the right, or whatever that looks like for whatever they were trying to optimize for. And that was essentially what we had set in motion.
That's awesome. So now it sounds like you have vertically oriented teams. They have, clear goals, clear KPIs, end-to-end ownership, and continuity, right, to get that depth in that problem area that you were describing.
That's right. Yeah. And I think if I were to, everyone always asks me the question, they're like, was it successful? Do you feel like you did what you set out to do? And at least back then, my answer would always be, I don't know, let's wait and see. Like, we're not going to realize the full impacts of whether or not something was truly successful until you see it in practice, until people have ramped up to a point where they feel very comfortable within the people they work with, the teams that they're in, the manager that they now report to. All of that is really important to kind of see through. And so I would largely say, like, we're still in the process of being able to figure out, like, do we have the level of continuity that we want? Do we have the level of ownership within the teams that we want? Or are there more changes or additional things that we would potentially want to do in the future? So I would say, like, it's been very much a learning process, and it's still very much in progress for us. We're not really over the other side just yet. It would feel too soon for me to almost say that. But so far, it seems to be going fairly well. And I would actually say it's resulted in quite a bit of initiatives now being done very independently and autonomously within these teams that's ultimately made it so that we can do more for the organization. So, been good so far, is what I would say. But, some of it is to be seen.
I have one final question for you, Zayna. It's like, reorgs in general can be turbulent. What are some ways that you're kind of thinking about, helping ensure that the team's morale is still high, that their productivity is still high, kind of in this new world?
Yeah. I think you really have to allow them to have mechanisms to be able to give you feedback. And for you to hear them out as a leader. So whether that means office hours, regular skip levels, regularly recognizing people in like all hands or kudos channels if you have them, those mechanisms for being able to hear people's feedback and recognize the good work that they're doing, those are so vital to be able to help people feel like they're doing something that means they're working on something that means something, that they're having an impact on the organization or the customers, and that they are sort of responsible for their own destiny a little bit. So I do regular things like I hold a coffee and questions on like Friday mornings with the entire engineering team, which is, I use a tool called Slido. They put in anonymous questions, or they can feel free to ask me sort of in person as well. And they ask me all sorts of stuff. They'll ask me, why we're working on a particular project, if we're going to change, if we're going to be, remote first now with, people trying to go back into the office as of late. They'll ask me all sorts of really interesting and challenging questions that I think they would have really no other avenue to be able to hear from me about. And giving them that helps them to understand what my perspective is, how they should be incorporating that into the regular everyday work that they're doing, but then also to follow up with me after the fact. And I've had several follow-up conversations where people are like, I don't know if I necessarily agreed with the thing that you said, and here's why. And that starts a discussion for us to be able to talk about what their feedback is, what they see maybe in their teams. Maybe the things that I'm saying is just like far out there. It doesn't necessarily apply. Giving them all of those medians to be able to share what their perspective is, what their feedback is I think incredibly vital for people to feel like they're actually making a difference, and that, the things that they do and say have meaning and result in some sort of outcome for the business as well. So all of it goes back to, having really high ownership, high accountability people who want to be able to share all of that feedback, but it's sort of your job as a leader to be able to give them all of those mediums as well.
I love that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Zayna, before we wrap up, I always like to ask guests, what is your favorite music to kind of do work to?
Oh, I listen to a lot of lofi stuff. So lofi or lo-fi, I think people call it different things. But it's I go onto YouTube and I have there's those like live streaming channels, and they just play this music, and they have like a cat animation, and I just leave that up on my screen. There's no words. It's great. It kind of feels a little bit like working in like a coffee shop or something like that, and just very productive, like soothing vibes to feel great. So yeah, that's usually what I end up using and grooving out to.
Cool. And Zayna, what is the best way for people to kind of follow you or your work on social media?
Yeah, people can always reach out to me over LinkedIn. That's primarily where I am most active. I do also have a website. I haven't updated in the longest time, but it does have a contact form. So people do actually reach out to me from that contact form, which is great. So I do every once in a while check that as well. And other than that, you can probably find me putzing around somewhere on a conference or doing an external talk or things like that. So people can always hear a little bit more from me within that realm too. But LinkedIn, I would say by and far is the first place to go in terms of being able to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, everyone be sure to follow Zayna on her LinkedIn. We'll also put a link to your LinkedIn and your website contact form in the show description below. So today we got to talk about all things engineering management. We talked about the path from IC to being a manager, and we talked about growing, scaling, and reorging teams. So Zayna, it has been my absolute pleasure just having you on the show today, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thanks for letting me do this, letting me, talk a little bit about some of the challenges in my journey as well. And I think it's, again, great that you're doing this podcast. I really wish I had something like this as I was going through my own management journey. And now I absolutely will be a listener moving forward as well.
Right on. And on that, to all of our listeners, thank you for making it to the end of another episode. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to see on the show, please send us an email at levelup@opslevel.com. Thank you again, everybody, for listening, and happy building. Bye.